Welcome back to another series. This is a valve series. In this program, I'm going to talk about aortic stenosis. We know that just to run a review, we know that the heart has got valves. It has got 4 chambers with valves that are a gateway from one chamber to another and from the heart to the rest of the body. We know that on the right side there are 2 chambers. There's the right atrium, the chamber that receives blood from the body through the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. Those are blood vessels that pour into the right atrium. And the right atrium releases the blood into the right ventricle, and through the valve which we call the mitral valve, the tricuspid valve, then the right ventricle will pump that blood through the pulmonary artery and through the pulmonary valve to the lungs. On the left side, there's the left atrium. The left atrium is the chamber that receives oxygenated blood. The blood that has received oxygen from the lungs into the left atrium. Then the left atrium will release the blood or pump the blood into the left ventricle, which is the main pumping chamber of the heart, and the blood from the left atrium has to pass through the mitral valve. Then the left ventricle will pump the blood through the aortic valve, which we are going to talk about problems that can affect the aortic valve. And the aortic valve is a gateway of blood from the left ventricle to the rest of the body. So on this slide is actually just a diagram of the valves as I explained them. We know that the 3 valves of the heart, the tricuspid valve, the pulmonary valve, the aortic valve, they are tri-leaflet valves. That means they've got 3 leaflets each, or 3 cusps each. The mitral valve on the left side of the heart is the only valve that has got 2 leaflets. So this diagram is just an anatomical representation of the valve architecture. The valve architecture, the way they are arranged, and the leaflets that they have. So there's a video, or there's a 3D representation of the valves from the inside to the outside, the attachments to the valves, which we call the cord tendonae, the papillary muscles that hold the valves to the walls of the heart. Is also showing how the valves behave when the other valves are closed, the other ones open. They don't close at the same time because there can be chaos or disorganized flow of blood. So this 3D reconstruction just explains or shows a videographic motion of the valves that close during contraction, the valves that open during diastole. So this is another slide which shows the anatomy of the aortic valve, the valve that we've zeroed in now. We've zeroed at the aortic valve because that's the one we are going to actually discuss and demonstrate what really happens there when something goes wrong. The anatomy, the normal anatomy or the normal structure of this valve is that it has got 3 leaflets. It's got 1 leaflet here, another one there, then the 3rd one. So it actually gives you a sign of a Mercedes-Benz sign. If you look at the model of a Benz, it always gives you this sign. So that's how we identify this valve, by looking at it having a Mercedes-Benz sign. So in this frame here on the left, it is at diastole. That means when the left ventricle has relaxed, it has to close, because if it opens, the blood coming in from the left atrium will go through the aortic valve. So it has to close to wait until the ventricle fills up. On the right side, this is the time when the ventricle has contracted. So the aortic valve has to open because it has to allow blood from the left ventricle to pass through the aortic valve to the rest of the body. So this is a normal anatomical structure or representation of the aortic valve. So the aortic valve has got 3 cusps with unrestricted systolic opening. So when the ventricle contracts, the valve should open without any restriction. The normal valve area usually is between 3 and 4 centimeters squared, and the normal opening distance or separation of the leaflets is supposed to be at least 2 centimeters apart. Now, other forms, there are also other forms of abnormal aortic valve structures that we see, which we call the congenital abnormally formed valves, whereby there's only maybe one leaflet, which we call the unicuspid aortic valve leaflet, or the bicuspid aortic valve leaflet. On this slide, we are seeing that we are comparing the normal to the abnormal. The abnormal on the right side, which is narrowed or stenosed, so it has only one valve leaflet. So these are also this other slide, it is showing the various forms. On top left, that is a normal Mercedes-Benz sign shape of the aortic valve. On the right top, that is a bicuspid aortic valve with a raphe, which means it has got 2 leaflets and a filament. On the left bottom, that's a complete bicuspid or 2 leaflet valve. And on the bottom right is the unicuspid or the 1 valve leaflet form of an aortic valve. Now, aortic stenosis is a very amazing disease. To start with, it's a surgical disease, which is only relieved by a surgical operation. It also gives a long period, what we call an asymptomatic period. So there's a long period where a client can live with the disease without any problem. Maybe from about up to above 20 years. Some people actually have symptoms above 30 or 40 years. Now, once symptoms start, according to this graph here, once symptoms set in, rapid progression usually happens without any intervention. So at the stage when the symptoms are discovered or the patient starts becoming symptomatic, that's the right time to intervene, and the intervention is usually to replace the valve. Because if the valve is not replaced, once symptoms have set in, progressions to heart failure and syncope or dizziness, the fainting attacks is quite hard, the shortness of breath, and secondary poor or deteriorating left ventricular function actually sets in. Now we can see that on this representation of the natural history, with valve replacement, the person can live actually like somebody who doesn't have a damaged or a diseased aortic valve. Now, without valve replacement, deterioration is quite rapid. So that's where now the surgeons, the people who receive these clients, must put a program and assess which time is for the operation to be done to replace the valve. Because once a delay is made, once intervention is not made, deterioration of the left ventricle becomes irreversible, and it's usually very difficult to operate on these clients because the heart may not start once it has been stopped and the valve is replaced, because the function of the myocardium has become irreversibly affected. So the best way is to have a good timing on how to attend or to intervene in these clients. Now, the causes, usually a client seen with aortic stenosis who is less than 50 years, most likely this is a congenital aortic stenosis or narrowing of the aortic valve, which with time becomes calcified and the stenosis becomes worse. For people above 70 years, usually these are degenerative issues. More calcification, even on a normal valve, leads to narrowing of the valve orifice or the valve area, and that causes symptoms to appear. So the congenital valves can either be unicuspid, which means one valve leaflet. They can be tricuspid, which tricuspid is normal. They can be bicuspid or quadricuspid, whereby there are 4 leaflets of the aortic valve. Degenerative, we know that it's just age. As we grow, calcium moves from our bones and go to settle on the valve and causes narrowing of the valve. Now, understanding aortic stenosis is also understanding hemodynamics. So hemodynamics, what we usually refer to the flow, the law of what we call PISA, the proximal isovolemic surface area, which entails that it's a flow acceleration principle, which entails that for any flow of blood going across a narrowed orifice, it has to accelerate. And acceleration means that it will need to generate more velocity to pass through that obstruction. So like in this slide, we see that this left side, that's where the left ventricle is, which has to pump blood through that narrowed valve, the aortic valve. The other side across on the right, that is now into the ascending aorta. The blood has moved through the valve, has to go now to the rest of the body. Now, in a setting of aortic stenosis, the ventricle has to generate an extra pressure, because usually the pressure in the left ventricle is supposed to be 120 millimeters of mercury. So for it to generate enough pressure to overcome the obstruction, or for the cardiac output to go through the narrowed valve, it has to generate another 100, a pressure gradient of 100 millimeters of mercury. So we need pressure of 220 millimeters to pass through this obstruction. But immediately the flow goes across the valve, the pressure in the ascending aorta reverts back to normal, to 120 millimeters of mercury. So this is where we actually remember the Bernoulli equation, which gives us that velocity, if we want to know the pressure gradient across this valve, we have to multiply multiply by velocity squared, which will give us the pressure gradient, which has to pass through here. In a normal aortic valve, there will be no extra pressure added to the normal left ventricular pressure. So we know that here the gradient is normal. Once the gradient is high, we know that there's an obstruction, because the ventricle or the blood has to accelerate and create high velocity to overcome the obstruction. Now, also just on this slide, a low velocity doesn't necessarily tell you that, well, it's maybe mild aortic stenosis, because there's what we call the high flow and the low flow state aortic stenosis. There will be high flow or there will be high pressure gradient across that stenotic valve if the left ventricular function is good. The left ventricle still has the force and the power to generate enough pressure to go across the stenotic valve. But if the ventricle has reached a stage where it has got poor function, it is dilated, so the velocity or the gradient across that stenotic valve will be low, because the ventricle doesn't have enough pressure to generate enough force to give us a high pressure gradient. So we should also look at the function of the left ventricle when we are looking at aortic stenosis. There's this slide which I usually put in every discussion when we are talking about valves and valve problems. So we look at the Bernoulli equation. This slide is from our friends in the US, the Mayo Clinic, the case of Mayo Clinic. It entails that pressure gradient is equal to 4 velocity squared. This is a simplified Bernoulli equation for cardiologists. This is quite a complex equation, but it has been simplified for cardiologists to calculate pressures across valves. There's also the hydraulic formula of flow, which entails that flow is equal to the area of the orifice or the narrowing multiplied by the velocity of the blood cells in that area. Also, it's a very helpful equation when we are assessing any valve. There's also the PISA method, which is the proximal isovolemic surface area, which is actually